Welcome to the 12th Annual Louisiana Book Festival and the Louisiana Writer Award. On behalf of the State Library and the Louisiana Center for the Book, we welcome you to the Louisiana Writer Award ceremony, this award is given annually by the Center for the Book in the State Library to recognize outstanding contributions to Louisiana's literary and intellectual life as exemplified by a writer's body of work. Just a few of the past recipients include Ernest Gaines, James Lee Burke, William Joyce, Carl Brasso, and Darrell Bork, who is here with us today. Tom Piazza's, of today's recipient, Bob Dylan said, Tom Piazza's writing pulsates with nervous electrical tension and reveals the emotions that we can't define. Tom is a resident of New Orleans, celebrated as a novelist and as a writer across all aspects of American music, and the 16th recipient of the Louisiana Writer Award. He was the principal writer for the innovative New Orleans-based HBO drama series Treme. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Book Forum, Oxford American, and many other periodicals. Piazza grew up on Long Island and graduated from Williams College in '76. In New York City, he worked as a jazz pianist, wrote about music for periodicals including The Village Voice, Newsday, and Downbeat, and began to write fiction. His early stories appeared in The Quarterly, Story, American Short Fiction, and other literary magazines. In 1991, he moved to Iowa City to attend the Iowa Writers Workshop, earning an MFA in fiction writing in 1993. In a recent interview with Susan Larson in The Advocate, Tom said, I began to think of New Orleans as home probably around the time I first saw pictures of it when I was in junior high school, looking through books about jazz in the library. It looked like no place I'd ever seen. Then when I visited it for the first time in 1987, I knew it was home. It just took me a while to move there. I've been here for 21 years now, and we're glad that you're here. Please welcome another great Louisianian, Lieutenant Governor Jay Dardenne, who will tell us a little more about our award winner.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for the great job that you and the staff at the State Library do in bringing this book festival to Louisiana every year and maintaining the importance of literature in Louisiana. It's my pleasure to tell you a little more detail about Tom's very illustrative career. In both his fiction and nonfiction, Piazza explores themes of cultural and personal identity, often using music as a prism through which to view American life. In 2003, his novel My Cold War won the Faulkner Society Award for the novel, and his debut short story collection, Blues and Trouble, published in 1996, won the James Michener Award. His book-length essay, Why New Orleans Matters, published just 2.5 months after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, won the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities Book of the Year Award. His 2008 novel, City of Refuge, follows the stories of two New Orleans families, one black and one white, during and after Hurricane Katrina. It was that year's One Book, One New Orleans selection, and it won the Willie Morris Award for Southern Fiction. In 2015, his novel, A Free State, set in Virginia and Philadelphia just before the Civil War, explores the difficult, multi-layered relationship between blackface minstrelsies is an extra letter there, minstrels and slavery and the deep, painful, and still contemporary riddles of race and society. His writing on American music, including jazz, blues, country, and bluegrass, has been similarly recognized. He's a 3-time winner of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for Music Writing for his books The Guide to Classic Recorded Jazz and Understanding Jazz, and for his Oxford American column on Southern music. And in 2004, he won a Grammy Award for his album notes to the 5-CD set Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues, A Musical Journey. His music pieces have been widely anthologized, appearing in Best Music Writing 2000, the Oxford Book of Great Music Writing, Studio A, the Bob Dylan Reader, and many other collections. Tom has traveled far and wide as a teacher and a lecturer. He's held the Eudora Weltley Chair for Southern Studies at Millsaps College and has been the visiting writer-in-residence at Loyola University, the Trias Visiting Writer at Hobart and William Smith College, a teaching writing fellow at the University of Iowa, and a core faculty member at the Bennington Writing Seminars. He's delivered lectures and readings at Columbia University, Middlebury College, Williams College, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of North Carolina, the Chautauqua Institute, the National Arts Club, and the Library of Congress, among many other venues. In the same interview with Susan Larson that Rebecca mentioned, Tom said this of this award: "It's an incredibly gratifying thing to feel in some kind of way that the place that you chose or adopted chose you back. And it's incredibly gratifying to see that the work I've done here is of value. I'm deeply honored." And Tom, we are deeply honored to present you with the 2015 Louisiana Writer Award. Congratulations.
Well, that's really something. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor Dardenne. Thanks to everybody for being here, just in advance of the monsoon. And it's a great honor. I want to thank everybody, before I even get started talking, who's been involved in this extraordinary festival, which, as we know, has been going on for years, especially Jim Davis, who does such heroic work putting everything together, and Robbie Wilson at the Louisiana Center for the Book. I want to also thank Rebecca Hamilton from the State Library, Al McDuff, who's the chair, and all the board members of the Louisiana Librarian Book Festival Foundation, and of course all the readers of Louisiana. That's what we do this for. And it's just an extraordinary thing, really, to be here. As Lieutenant Governor Dardenne said, I am a Northerner, although I do come from the South Shore of Long Island, so I should get some kind of credit for that, I think. And I did move to Louisiana 21 years ago out of love for the place, an abiding love that was there for a long time, as I said to Susan in that wonderful interview that she conducted. I want to say a couple quick things, appreciations to people for being here. I'm very, very fortunate that my longtime editor of 6, or is it 7 books now, Cal Morgan from HarperCollins is here, and I'd just like to appreciate him for coming. Cal has been an incredible support. Every writer should be lucky enough to have an editor like Cal Morgan, but there's only one. So I want to make a special mention to my mom, about who I'm going to say a few things in this little talk I'm going to give. We were hoping that Mom could be here today, but the logistics just didn't work out. She's back up on Long Island, and I know she'll be seeing the video of this talk. And I want to thank her for all the support through the years and the encouragement, without which, obviously, I wouldn't be here today for a lot of reasons. And lastly, I want to thank my partner in true love, Mary Howell, who's also here, sitting over there, without whom I don't really even know how to finish that sentence. But she is my much, much, much better half, and I'm just so proud and happy that we're here together today. Again, as Lieutenant Governor Dardenne said, it's great to be recognized as maybe having done something of value for the place that you love and have come to call home. And it's true, Louisiana, and really specifically New Orleans, but all of Louisiana felt like home to me a long time before I even visited here. It's incredible to be in such extraordinary company as the other previous 15 winners of this Louisiana Writer Award. Among them are some friends. Daryl, I'm so glad you're here today. Friends and literary heroes, and it's just an extraordinary thing now to be numbered in their company. I was asked to speak some about my development as a writer, and of course that's inseparable from one's development as a reader. The two go not just hand in hand, they're intertwined absolutely inseparably. I've lived with and through books my entire life, even longer than I've lived with my other twin passion, which is music. So it's appropriate that this day happens under the auspices of the State Library. I want to say some of my earliest memories in life are of sitting on the couch in my living room, our living room, next to my mom, as she read to me from the Childcraft books. Do any of you remember the Childcraft books? It was like a little encyclopedia, not a little, it was a full encyclopedia for children that included stories, poems, little biographies, historical vignettes, and it was just wonderful. And I remember sitting there with my mom reading to me about Peter Rabbit and his adventures with Mr. McGregor in the Briar Patch. High adventure in the Briar Patch. And I will tell you the truth, I was absolutely astonished at a very early age by the power that seemed to inhere in these little marks on the page that at first were very abstract and mysterious to me. They were helped along by the book's little modest illustrations, but it was the lines, those little lines that I later learned to call letters, that summoned this world of the Briar Patch and the fence and the angry farmer and the wily rabbit. It was magic. It's still magic. Maybe because of this, I learned to read very early. I think a lot of writers do. Words, certainly, on the page had power. They brought you somewhere, and they made you want to know what happened next. They made you sympathize. They made you pull for some characters and not for others. They made you fizzy with anticipation. Just by their presence on the page, even before you knew what they were saying, you knew they were saying something. I wanted at a very early age to be able to write those words down and exercise that power for myself, really even then, I believe. I remember, I should say, the first words that I wrote. I don't know if any other writers, I'd be interested to know, have this experience. I can tell you right now, they were cat, I think that's a common one, ant, little ant, ha, you, which I think was fairly sophisticated for a kid of that age, with that little O-U, and to, T-O. Those words on paper, when I wrote them down, were mysterious and very magical to me. They were things, and yet they were not things. You wrote, and suddenly there was something in front of you that was not there before. It was visual, and yet it represented a sound also. And if you said them one after another, they made a rhythm too, although I didn't know that word yet. I couldn't get over it, the sense that, however slightly, I had made a change in the world by writing a word. And I want to tell you this also, I remember very clearly, and this is strange, but I remember very clearly the first sentence I ever made up and wrote down on my own. This is true. And I'm going to reveal it to you now. This is after 12 books. I'm going to tell you the very first sentence I ever wrote in my life, and it contains the wisdom of the ages in it. It was, ha to you, ant. I think I had some idea of an ant thwarted in a task. In any case, this was 4 of the 5 words that I knew to write. But what I actually do remember very clearly was the sense, even more powerful and mysterious than what I experienced writing those individual words disconnectedly, that something had changed in the world, in my world at least. Random words written down individually had somehow bonded in a way that exploded into 3 dimensions. They were suddenly alive and dynamic together. The words together became more than just the words themselves. They advanced into the world and annexed territory. I think I came alive as a writer on that day. I may have been 3 or 4. Also, as far as back as I can remember, my mother used to take me to the library. It was upstairs around back of one of a row of stores along Merrick Road in Seaford, New York. That's on Long Island, where I grew up. And there was a little row of like delicatessens and sundry stores. And you got to the library by climbing a dusty little linoleum stairway up to the 2nd floor. It was really an extraordinarily long flight to me at that time, but I was more than willing. I think it instilled in me the idea that you had to work a little to mine the treasures that were to be found in those magical books. I wish I could remember the visuals of that room itself. There are no photos of it that I know of. I don't. I do remember maxing out my borrowing privileges every time we went there. I would take gigantic stacks, as many as they would let me take, and then bringing them back, I guess 2 weeks later was the borrowing period, to exchange for more. I loved that library. Eventually, it moved to its own building instead of being perched over the delicatessen, and that's where I read James Joyce for the first time, and Hemingway and T.S. Eliot, and that's also where I heard Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie for the first time in their record collection. But I'm getting ahead of my story. I want to tell you that in grade school, we were finally able to acquire our very own books. We could order them from the Scholastic catalog. They would arrive on a special day, and it was a big thing. This box would happen, and everybody would kind of gather around. The teacher would hand you, you ordered this, you ordered this. What a feeling. What a feeling that was. The first one that I remember owning that I had picked out instead of one that I had received as a present, the first book that I actually remember ordering and owning was The Indians Knew by Tilly S. Pine. It was part of a series for grade schoolers detailing the specialized knowledge pioneered by various ethnic and national groups. So there was the Eskimos knew, the Africans knew, the Egyptians knew. I think Tilly S. Pine might have written all of them. In any case, I could not get over the fact that someone named Tilly S. Pine actually existed and was probably out there walking around somewhere and had been able to give form to these words and somehow make them be a book that then I could own and read over and over again. She was my first literary god, I guess you'd have to say. Tilly S. Pine, an author. There was one of her, and she made books that could be read by many, sort of like the Loaves and Fishes. At any rate, I treasured every book I was able to get. I felt that I had the riches of the world at my literal fingertips. As I got into junior high school and then high school, I began to receive real books, grown-up books, as presents, and the feeling was not to be equaled. My mother gave me a copy of the collected poems of Dylan Thomas with its austere but oddly artful typography on the plain white background of the cover. At that time, I began to get very interested in jazz, and I remember receiving a copy of The World of Duke Ellington by Stanley Dance with elegant hardcover with a sleek black background and royal blue lettering. A collection of Robert Frost's poems and a compact anthology of poetry edited by someone whose name I can't recall. I remember getting a copy of E.E. Cummings' poetry. There was Womrath's bookstore in Hempstead, where I got several volumes of the Kings of Jazz series. Each one of these things was just an explosion of glory and happiness and possibility in my life. It's true. And then one year, I got a copy from my mom of a book called Jazzmen. It was edited by Frederick Ramsey and Charles Edward Smith. It had a bright orange cover. It was a Harvest Books paperback, I remember. And it had a fascinating photo section in the middle full of photos of musicians with mysterious names like King Oliver and Bunk Johnson and Jack Teagarden, and even more mysterious photos, black and white, of a place called New Orleans. These photos exerted an odd pull, on my mind. I knew instantly that I needed someday to see this place for myself. There were fantastic old buildings with lettering on the sides and bandstands with railings in front and marching bands from the early 1900s. Books, literature, music, history, photography, all became fused in my nervous system, I think, along with the weirdly intuitive sense that it was all hooked up somehow with New Orleans and other Louisiana place names like New Iberia and Algiers and Barataria. The library was one of my favorite places, as I said, and the librarians were my friends. In particular, I'd like to mention Mrs. Jacqueline Salvato. She befriended me and recommended books to me all the time, and once she even pulled a caper with my mother. When I was perhaps 12, there was no book I wanted more in the world than The Country Blues by Samuel B. Charters. I had taken this book out from interlibrary loan a number of times, and I think I actually would have eaten it if I could have. I read it over and over again. I don't know that that book survived my numerous readings. I just couldn't get over. I pored over the photos of Blind Lemon Jefferson and Leroy Carr and Scrapper Blackwell and Blind Boy Fuller. But I thought such a book must be as rare and valuable as the Hope Diamond. But apparently my mom and Mrs. Salvato conspired to find me a copy of the book somehow. It was the British edition. And opening that particular package on a birthday morning was a thrill really unequaled ever. Thank you, Mom, and thanks, Mrs. Salvato. To the librarians in the house, don't ever think that your efforts are wasted. They're often transformative in people's lives. And of course, while we're on libraries, I may as well talk about bookstores. You remember bookstores? The ones that my mom would take me into New York to see. All the fantastic, dusty, used bookstores along 4th Avenue downtown where I found the most amazing things. And later, when I moved into New York City after college, my first job was at a Barnes & Noble when there was only one Barnes & Noble. It was on 5th Avenue and 18th Street. And they had opened a sale annex across the street where they had remaindered books and they had used books at extraordinary discounts. And if you worked there, of course, you got an even more extraordinary discount. So, of course, I spent all my money on books. And that was where I read Saint-Exupéry and E.M. Forster and Susan Sontag and Norman Mailer, who later became my friend and mentor. And there were so many other bookstores, the Argosy, the Little Hole in the Wall on West 4th Street, whose name I can't remember, the Strand bookstore, which is still there, and the Great Gotham Book Mart, which is not. And a fantastic place on 5th Avenue in Greenwich Village called Dauber and Pine, with a cave-like downstairs room and shelves that reached way up into a dark and cobwebby ceiling. The owners were a pair of Dickens characters. Mr. Dauber had the most sallow complexion I had ever seen on a living human, and his shirts were worn completely through at the collar. He had a frightening recall for where any given volume might be. He could spelunk down into the store's cavernous lower level and exhume anything you might request. Mr. Pine was a short man with a seraphic expression, never without a little Greek fisherman's cap. I was brokenhearted when that store closed to make room for a glossy NYU building. Many years later, I went to a movie at a theater way up on Broadway in the 90s. I think it was a film by the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, and I couldn't find anybody who wanted to see it with me. Anyway, I went in, I slipped into my seat in the theater, and I noted an elderly couple sitting right next to me, and the man had this familiar-looking Greek fisherman's cap on his head. And I said, "Mr. Pine?" And he smiled and said, "Yes, how are you?" He smiled broadly, shook my hand across his companion, saying, "This is my wife, Tilly." I gaped at her, and I said, "Tilly Pine? Tilly S. Pine? Are you Tilly S. Pine?" Anyway, I just sort of unloaded on her my purchase of The Indians New and a total confused homage to her influence on my life, and I think she was pleased, if perhaps a little overwhelmed. I don't know that anybody else had ever quite unloaded on her that way. Anyway, I don't think I've ever been quite as starstruck again at meeting an author I admired. That was unbelievable. Tilly S. Pine. Anyway, my early years in New York in the late 70s, when I was both trying to be a jazz pianist and a writer, were full of books, and it's just a thrill of discovery, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows in their own way and with their own particular gods and demigods. I consumed it all. I consumed Joan Didion and Herman Melville and F. Scott Fitzgerald, Flaubert, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all of it, Ralph Ellison. I gorged myself. I wrote a lot of nonfiction. I got published. I spent 4.5 years on a novel that was never published, mercifully. I couldn't get the hang of fiction somehow, although I read it in prodigious gulps. I made my living delivering furniture, doing phone sales, clerking in a bookstore, actually in Barnes & Noble eventually. I was a busboy. I was a messenger at the New Yorker magazine for 1.5 years. That's a whole other story. And eventually I began proofreading and copy editing. I saw my friend Mary Norris is here, who wrote a charming and a wonderful book about being a copy editor and a proofreader. And I had a real knack for that. But those photos of New Orleans were lodged in my mind, I must say, and they fused with all the great New Orleans music I heard as time went along. Not just Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and Jelly Roll Morton and the New Orleans Rhythm Kings, but Dr. John and the Wild Tchoupitoulas and Professor Longhair and Fats Domino. And I swore that I needed to see this town. And I finally did in 1987. I came down for Jazz Fest. And that was a supremely difficult time, actually, in my life. I was living in New York City. I had no money to speak of. I almost didn't come. But a casual acquaintance with whom I was discussing the question gave me an invaluable piece of advice, which I pass along to you. Go into debt. And I did, and it changed my life. By the way, that's advice that I've been following ever since, I should say. In any case, I had been trying to write fiction and missing something, not quite getting it, just as I'd felt about words before I wrote my first sentence. Something wasn't quite happening. Ha to you, Aunt. There was a connection there to be made, and if you made it, the lights would go on. Yeah? But I landed in New Orleans, and I felt as if I was suddenly alive in a new way. That's true, a better way, in fact. And sitting at a table in the Napoleon House, I wrote the first draft of my first good story, which was titled Brownsville, and it was set in New Orleans. I felt, as I was writing it, that something was suddenly coordinated in a new way, and I knew I was writing something all my own, and that I had cracked something open. The lights had gone on. The same feeling I had when I wrote that first sentence, and is it any wonder that I fell deeply in love with the city, and I visited every chance I could. I began publishing short stories in literary magazines, Story, American Short Fiction, Gordon Lish's wonderful The Quarterly, and I was also writing about music for the Village Voice and the New York Times, and once for the New York Times Magazine, but New York was full of distractions, and it became clear to me that if I were really to make something of myself as a fiction writer, which is what I really wanted to do, I would need to get out of New York and concentrate harder. I applied to the Iowa Writers' Workshop, although the idea of moving from New York City to Iowa was almost inconceivable. They offered me their best fellowship, and in 1991, at the age of 36, I moved don't bother doing the math now, thank you. At the age of 36, I moved halfway across the country to Iowa City. And there I wrote most of my first book of fiction, the story collection Blues and Trouble. During my second year there, I began writing for the New York Times again. And in the spring of 1994, they sent me from Iowa to New Orleans to interview Dr. John, because he had just published his autobiography, Under a Hoodoo Moon, which I recommend to you all. And I decided to move to New Orleans, and I did in late August of that year, 1994. So I've been in New Orleans 21 years, sorry. It's hard to believe. I've also learned about Lafayette and Eunice and a lot of wonderful places in Southwest Louisiana. So many friends have taught me so much being here. New Orleans has been the center, though, and since moving here, I've seen all 12 of my books through to publication, beginning with The Guide to Classic Recorded Jazz and my story collection, Blues and Trouble, which Cal Morgan published almost 20 years ago, all the way up to my third novel, which just came out, which is A Free State, which I hope you all take a look at. New Orleans and Louisiana in general have been the place where I felt free to be who I am, and where my imagination has been stimulated, and where I've been given the gift of community. I was and I am extremely proud that in the aftermath of our collective trauma in 2005, the failure of the levees that we call Katrina, for convenience, I was able to write a couple of books that seemed to have been meaningful to my fellow Louisianians, and particularly New Orleanians. Why New Orleans Matters was a kind of rebuttal, I guess you'd say, to the ignorant voices calling for the city's abandonment at that time. And then the novel City of Refuge, about, as Lieutenant Governor Dardenne said, about two families, one black and one white, going through the experience excuse me, of the storm and the displacement that resulted. After that novel, I thought I was kind of finished writing about New Orleans for a little while, because it was really, sort of reliving all those events was took a lot. But then David Simon called me and invited me to write for HBO's Treme. And to quote a line from The Godfather, that really is an offer you don't refuse. So for the first 3 of that show's 3.5 seasons, I was a principal writer there, and that was a great, great experience. But being able to contribute something to my community this way and perhaps spread some understanding of and love for this place into the world beyond Lake Pontchartrain has been the greatest privilege and honor of my life. I'm so proud to be a part of this state and this community. And to be given this honor, the Louisiana Writer Award, fills me with wonder and gratitude. And I thank you. Thank you.
Tom, thank you for your contribution to Louisiana literature and for your love of Louisiana and all the written words that you've composed that have given so many of us a great deal of pleasure. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning, braving the weather. Please don't leave the building. You don't want to go out in the rain. You want to stick around and hear some of the presentations that are taking place on the floor below us. So thanks to everyone for being here. And again, congratulations, Tom.
Thanks.
Thanks very much. Congratulations.
For one thing, I think Louisiana gives you a strong encouragement to be exactly who you are all the time, especially in my town of New Orleans, which I've loved for many, many years now and lived in for 21. Also, it's constantly stimulating, and it's been a specific influence on several of my books, especially Why New Orleans Matters and City of Refuge, which were both about the events around the levee failures and the storm that we call Katrina in 2005.
Your reaction to winning the award?
Well, I was bowled over when I was told that I was going to win the award. I mean, it's really quite an event in your life when you've adopted a place as your home and you feel that you've made a contribution to that place and it's recognized in that way. It's an unequaled thrill, really and truly.